coming along to this, the last of our series of political psychology seminars. Sorry, I'm just turning off the transcription. We've had a very good series, including a few weeks ago, Joe Phillips talking about effective polarization. But I guess polarization is one of those big topics we're all interested in, aren't we? That has both political psychology interest, but also real world relevance. So we're having a second bite at the cherry today with Francesco Rigoli, and just to prove that we are genuinely a multidisciplinary audience and body. Francesco is a psychologist, so not a political scientist. So he's coming from the kind of psychology end of the spectrum. Francesco's at City University in London, and as you can see from his title, he's going to be talking about polarization on a global scale. So usual format, around 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So Francesco, the floor is yours. You probably just want to stick it on slideshow, because we can see the bar on the side.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben, for the opportunity to present today.
Sorry, Francesco, do you just put it on slideshow, because we've just got the full, we've got all the screen with all the bits. Just might be a bit easier.
Can you see? Because now it's on slideshow. Can you see it?
Not for us, it's not.
Okay.
So we can see the slides, but they're not on the slideshow format.
So let me do something slightly different.
The joys of Teams, eh?
Exactly. I will share the entire screen.
Okay.
Can you see the screen now?
No.
What about now?
Yes, but that's not on the slideshow. There we go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Amazing. Well, okay, let's start again. Thanks a lot, Ben, for the opportunity to present today. And the title is Polarization and Modernization on a Global Scale. And this is based on a paper I published recently in the journal Cross-Cultural Research. So for those of you who are interested, you can find all details there. As Ben said at the beginning, there's a lot of interest nowadays on polarization. Here, I show you the books published in the last 5 to 7 years where the title includes the word polarization. This is based on a Google search, and these are only some of the results that I got, just to stress again how relevant is this topic, both in academia and within the general public. And therefore, there's a lot of ongoing research on polarization that has provided great insight. However, I think an important limitation of this body of work is that it has focused mainly on the West, especially on the US. And this restricted geographical scope is problematic, I believe, for various reasons. First of all, it means that we don't know much about polarization outside the West. Second, even if we want to fully understand polarization in the West, it's important to have a frame of reference to compare it against the context. And if we look at other countries, in countries outside the West, they can offer a useful frame of reference to evaluate the level of polarization within the West. And the third limitation of the restricted geographical scope is that we know little about which characteristics of a country promote polarization. So we have at least 3 important limitations of most of the research on polarization that encourage the field to extend the scope to an international context, or at least ideally even to a global context, to look at what happens around the world. And so based on this reasoning, I will present a study that tries to go in this direction. And the question that I studied is, what's the relationship between modernization and polarization across the different countries of the world? Before looking at the data, a couple of clarifications about this question. First of all, what do I mean by polarization? The literature uses different definitions of this phenomenon. The one that I use is called ideological polarization, introduced by DiMaggio and colleagues in the 90s. And essentially, it corresponds to the standard deviation of an item or a set of items. For example, if you want to quantify polarization on the left-right scale, we can simply use a scale ranging from 1 to 10. 1 corresponds to left and 10 to right. We can calculate the standard deviation in our sample, and the results corresponds to our level of polarization. Okay, so this is how polarization is defined here. The other clarification is about the choice of modernization. So why did I choose to look at this construct? And the reason is that if you look at the literature, it comes up that modernization is the variables that distinguishes countries, which is probably the most influential, really. Other variables, income inequality, culture, geographical features are important, very important, but probably not as much as modernization. And here are just some examples of differences across countries with different level of modernizations. Highly modernized countries are more affluent. The economy is based on productive sectors, industry, services. People are better educated. They use the technology more, and also they tend to live in cities. And the demography is very different. Highly modernized countries have greater life expectancies, smaller infant mortality, and therefore the average age of the population is higher. So these are all differences that concern the structure of society. However, there's research that has looked also at the link between modernization and culture, people mentality. And an important study in this context is the research done by Ingelthal and Welzer on people values. And these authors found that in poorly modernized countries, people cherish what they call materialistic values. For example, economic safety, respect for authorities, for tradition and conformity. By contrast, in highly modernized countries, people cherish what they call self-expression values, such as freedom, independence, self-expression, and creativity. So based on these findings, we can see that modernization is very influential, both in terms of social structure and also in terms of culture, in terms of psychology. And based on that, when we explore a new cultural phenomenon, such as polarization, on a global scale, on an international level, it's a sensible choice to start by looking at the role of modernization. And this is why I chose to focus on this variable. Moreover, we can formulate various sensible hypotheses about the link between modernization and polarization. And I will discuss these hypotheses next. The first hypothesis, which I called a transition model, claims that polarization is higher in poorly modernized countries. And the rationale behind this hypothesis is that when a country is at an early stage of modernization, two different groups of people coexist in the country. The first group involves people who are living a modern lifestyle. They live in city, they are richer and better educated. The other group of people involves those who conduct a pre-modern lifestyle. They live in the countryside and they tend to work in agriculture and they're relatively less educated. And according to this model, the coexistence of these two different people leads to the coexistence of two very different cultures, two very different mentalities, one rooted in tradition and the other rooted in modernity. In turn, this cultural clash will lead to greater polarization. And this is why the transition model predicts that polarization is higher in poorly modernized countries. However, we can follow an alternative line of reasoning that leads to the opposite conclusion, the prediction that polarization is higher in highly modernized countries. And here, the rationale behind this prediction that I call complexity model is that as modernization progresses, social complexity grows. For example, the division of labor becomes more specialized. Consumption choices becomes more specific. And in turn, this greater complexity would be reflected in a higher heterogeneity of opinions, beliefs, and attitudes. And this greater heterogeneity would lead to greater polarization. And this is why the complexity model asserts that polarization is higher in highly modernized countries. Now, both the transition model and the complexity model views polarization as a monolithic construct. However, this assumption can be criticized if we look at the literature on political attitudes, and in the talk I will focus on political attitudes. This literature often distinguishes between two different dimensions, a social dimension and an economic dimension. The economic dimension distinguishes people with left-wing views of the economy, people who support income equality, who support welfare and redistributive policies, versus people who report right-wing views of the economy, people who support laissez-faire, who criticize welfare and redistributive policies. The social dimension opposes people with a liberal view on issues such as immigration, gender equality, divorce, abortion, homosexuality, versus people who express right-wing views, conservative views on these issues. Now, if we acknowledge the distinction between the economic and social dimension, we can speculate that the link between polarization and modernization varies across dimension. And to decide, to hypothesize how this link may vary, we can consider the literature from Engelhardt and Welzel that I mentioned before. So these authors tell us that in poorly modernized countries, people care more about material issues. Now, we can draw a parallel between material issues and the economic dimension. So we can speculate that the economic dimension is more important in poorly modernized countries. And on this basis, we can derive the prediction that in the economic dimension, polarization is higher in poorly modernized countries. The reason being that the economic dimension may be more salient in these countries. We can use a similar line of reasoning for the social dimension. If we look at the findings from Engelhardt and Welzel, they tell us that in highly modernized countries, people cherish self-expression values. We can draw a parallel between self-expression values and the social dimension. And this lead to the prediction that regarding the social dimension, polarization is higher in highly modernized countries. Okay, once again, the logic being that the social dimension is more salient in highly modernized countries. So to wrap up, this hypothesis, which I called reorientation model, asserts that the link between polarization and modernization varies across dimension. In the social dimension, polarization is higher in highly modernized countries. In the economic dimension, polarization is higher in poorly modernized countries. We can also consider one fourth model, which I called the conformity model, and which is based on a famous book from Norris and Ingelhart called titled Cultural Backlash. And one of the central claims of the book is that as modernization progresses, public opinion moves from conservative views to liberal views. And this process can be broken down into three different stages. Stage one, which is described here, is characteristic of early stages of modernization, in which public opinion clusters around conservative views. Since everyone shares the same views, conformity pressures are strong, and therefore polarization is small in this situation. And according to this theory, this situation is the one that characterizes poorly modernized countries. The second stage occurs at a later phase of modernization, and here the public opinion is in the middle. We have some people who are conservative, some people who are liberal, and given this greater plurality, conformity pressures are weaker and polarization is allowed to grow. And according to this theory, this scenario is the one that characterized highly modernized countries today. Now, the theory also makes a prediction of what will happen in the future if modernization patterns that apply today continue. And the prediction is that public opinion in modernized countries will shift towards liberal positions. And once again, conformity pressures will strengthen and polarization will diminish. So according to this theory, the high polarization that can be observed in rich countries is a temporary phenomenon. So this model, the conformity model, predicts that polarization is higher in highly modernized countries today. So overall, we have four theories, four different models. Here you can see a summary of their predictions. They're all quite reasonable a priori, and they make different predictions. So we can look at the data and see which model is best supported by the data. And to do that, I analyzed data from the World Value Survey. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but just to briefly summarize, this is the largest multinational data set about beliefs, opinions, attitudes. It covers more than 100 countries, sampled over 40 years. So it's a very rich data set. And from this data set, I extracted items relative to various dimensions, the dimensions that I mentioned before. So one dimension is the economic one. The other dimension is the social, but since the social dimension is a bit more complex, I've broken it down into three subcategories. One of these is what I call free choice. These attitudes about abortion, divorce, homosexuality, and suicide. The other dimension is gender equality and then immigration. And finally, I also consider an item about left-right positioning in policy. in politics. So overall, we have 5 dimensions: economic, free choice, gender equality, immigration, and left-right position. Now, based on these data, I fitted a set of regression models where the dependent variable was polarization. And as I said before, this is the standard deviation for the dimension under investigation. The focal predictor is modernization, and I operationalized this in terms of per capita GDP. Now, in the literature, you can find alternative approaches. However, using per capita GDP as a proxy for modernization is still a common procedure, and it has several advantages. So this is why I chose to use it. I'm not entering the debate about what's the best way to operationalize modernization. I just want to clarify the method that I've used and to say that it's still sensible and common in the literature. Also, these models included a few control variables, population and income inequality. And these are the data. So this is polarization for the economic dimension. On the X, we have per capita GDP. On the Y, we have polarization. And in this case, we can see that polarization is higher in poor countries. And here you can see which models fit with this pattern. In this case, the transition model and reorientation model works. The complexity and conformity model do not work. This slide examines the role of demographic variables. And what I did here, for each country, separately for each country, I fitted a model of the economic dimension having sex, age, education, and income as predictor. I extracted the regression parameter for each predictor, and I obtained these scatter plots. So what can we learn from these scatter plots? For example, let's take the example of education here on the bottom left. From this scatter plot, we can learn 2 things. First of all, the effect of education, the B for education, is overall negative. So this tells us that in most countries, the highly educated are more right-wing on the economy than the poorly educated. And this is true across the board. The second thing that we can learn from this graph is that this effect is stronger in poor countries. In other words, the education divide on economics is greater in poor countries. The difference between highly and poorly educated on economic opinions is greater in poor countries. And this is interesting because it helps us explaining why polarization is higher in poor countries. Partially, this occurs because the education divide is greater in poor countries. Let's look at the free choice dimension. Remember, this concerns attitudes about abortion, divorce, homosexuality, and suicide. And now the effect is the opposite. Polarization is higher in rich countries. If we look at the role of demographics, we can see that the demographics are more divisive in rich countries with regard to free choice matters. For example, take once again education. You can see that the B for education, the effect of education, is usually is positive, right? That means that usually the highly educated are more liberal on free choice matters. And the second thing that we can learn here is that this effect is stronger in rich countries. In other words, the education divide in rich countries is stronger with regard to free choice matters, okay? So you can see that the divide for sex, age, and education is stronger in rich countries. Let's look at gender equality. And now the pattern is once again like the one for economics. Polarization is higher in poor countries. I will skip this about demographics. These are the data for immigration. And once again, the pattern is the same as for economics and gender equality. Polarization is higher in poor countries, which I think is quite interesting because we think about immigration as a highly polarized domain in the West. But this data suggests that polarization for immigration is stronger in poor countries. So somehow these data do not support the general view. I will not talk much about immigration, but if you have questions about this, I have some interesting data to show you. The final dimension is the left-right positioning, which is a sort of broader, a general index of people's attitudes and opinions. And in this domain, once again, polarization is higher in poor countries. So, overall, what can we conclude based on the findings? Here you have the different models and how they perform in the different domains, okay? And from this table, we can learn, first of all, that none of the models explain all the different domains. The second thing that we can learn is that the transition model works most of the time. So it's probably into something. Remember, the transition model is the model that claims that polarization is higher in poor countries. So it works well everywhere except for the free choice domain. The transition model fails in this domain, whereas all other models seem to work well in this domain. So a possibility is that we can use the transition model as a general framework, but we need to integrate it with some other models in order to explain what's going on in the domain of free choice. And the question is, which of these three models does a better job in explaining free choice? And to test this, we can look at some specific predictions made by the conformity model. So remember, the conformity model proposes that public opinion shifts from conservative to liberal views as modernization progresses. And so countries at early stages of modernization show a conservative views and little polarization. Countries at a later stage of modernization shows an intermediate score and greater polarization. And we can test these predictions looking at these scatter plots. So here on top, you have per capita GDP on the X and average score on the Y. Note that this is the average score, it's not polarization. Polarization is about standard deviation, whereas here we have the average score. It tells us whether a country is more or less liberal on free choice matters. And the scatter plot tells us that rich countries are more liberal than poor countries. This is consistent with the conformity model. There's another aspect we can consider here, which is the role of the intermediate score. So the free choice dimension was measured on a scale ranging from 1 to 10. So the intermediate score is 5. Now, the conformity model predicts that rich countries show an average score which is closer to 5. And this scatter plot confirms that this is the case. Indeed, the average score is closer to 5 in rich compared to poor countries. Once again, consistent with the conformity model. We can also test the predictions of the conformity model in the graphs on the bottom. Here on the X, we have the distance between the average score and the intermediate score. Remember, this is equal to 5, okay? So if the average score in a country is equal to 5, then this variable is equal to 0. If the average score is far from 5, then the variable on the x will grow. On the y, we have ideological polarization. So essentially, this graph tells us that when the distance from the intermediate score is small, polarization is higher, okay? Sorry. So when the average score is close to the middle of the scale, then polarization is higher. Once again, consistent with the conformity model. So overall, the data in the free choice domain fit with predictions from the conformity model. Note that if we look at these predictions for other dimensions, we don't obtain these results. So the conformity model doesn't perform as well. To conclude, the data that I showed you seem to fit quite well with the transition model in most of the cases. Remember that these claims that polarization tend to be higher in poor countries because people living a modern lifestyle coexist with people living a pre-modern lifestyle in these countries. And this may lead to a sort of cultural clash, resulting in greater polarization. So the transition model seems to work quite well, except for the free choice domain. So there's something about free choice aspects which is not captured here. The conformity model seems to explain what's going on in the free choice domain. The conformity model asserts that poor countries show conservative opinions on free choice matters and small polarization, whereas rich countries show a public opinion which is in the middle of the scale, which is divided, and show greater polarizations in this domain. Ben, shall I stop here, or do you have other 5 minutes?
I think if there's important stuff, Francesco, maybe a little bit less than 5 minutes if you can, but yes, that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to briefly mention, to look at this data from a slightly different angle. So we can consider the role of education and income, which are the variables linked with social class, with social status, and see how the role of these variables changes based on modernization, based on per capita GDP. And this is interesting. So let's take the case of education. There's a lot of debate about how education has become divisive in the West in politics. For example, education is one of the best predictors of whether a person will vote for right-wing populist parties. And so this suggests that perhaps education has become more divisive in rich countries. Is this supported by the data? And the answer to this question is that this claim is supported only partially. This claim is true for free choice and for immigration. So here, indeed, education is more divisive in rich countries. However, with regard to the economy, the opposite occurs. Education is more divisive in poor countries. So in other words, the education divide, there's a sort of reorientation process. The education divides shifts from the economy to free choice and immigration. And the question is, why does this occur? A possibility is that this depends from a shift from an elite education system to a mass education system. The first characteristic of poor countries, the second characteristics of rich countries. So let me briefly explain. In poor countries, the education system, the high education is reserved for a small group of people. These people may perceive them as part of an elite, and this may lead them to embrace right-wing views of the economy, boosting polarization in poor countries. By contrast, In rich countries, the higher education is open to the masses, and so the highly educated might perceive themselves not as part of an elite, but part of the people, part of the general population. And this may lead them to abandon right-wing views and at the same time to stress other issues that are dear to the highly educated. And these are free choice and immigration. And this will lead to a boost of polarization regarding free choice and immigration. Very briefly, it's interesting also to look at the role of income and whether it changes based on per capita GDP. And in general, the role of income doesn't change. The exception is the economy. Here, income is more divisive in rich compared to poor countries, which is quite interesting because usually we think that in rich countries, social class, especially income differences, are not very relevant for public opinion. But this data suggests that this is not the case. Especially in rich countries, the divide between the rich and the poor on economic opinions is large. And by the way, everywhere, richer people are more on the right on the economy. So this means that this difference is particularly salient in rich countries. Great. So I think I can stop here. Thanks for listening.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Francesco. Wow. there was an awful lot there, and I guess what I like about these kind of modernization theories is, well, what I like is that they explain things in a grand scale. What I kind of dislike is they take the politics out, but maybe we'll come back to that. So we've got plenty of time for questions. Well, we've got 20 minutes actually. So if people want to put their hand up or just jump in. Oh, let me just hang this. Let me just stop. I'll stop recording.